All right, well, here I am. Getting a little chilly down here. I'm going to put the hoodie on. Representing Chain React Conference here. I was there for React Native this past year. It was a great conference. Love it. But we're going to wear the Big Nerd Ranch hoodie here. It's chilly down here in Atlanta, Georgia. Real chilly. I'm sure you can identify if you're up in the north and buried under snow. All right, so we are ready now to dive back in and continue on. And as a note, if you're watching on the live stream, I'm so glad you're here. As I said before, whether you're on vacation today or on de facto vacation, either way. But please say hello. I'd love to chat with folks. Love to get your questions and feedback on how you like to test Redux actions and reducers and things like that. Glad to jump in and kind of chat with you. But now we get to the point where things are really interesting, where we start to work on connecting to a backend API to store our data. We're going to test drive that, and a lot of questions can come up when it comes to end-to-end testing of connecting to an API. And it'll be fun to explore those together. In this case, I was thinking about it just now, and I think that what I'm going to do is actually break from the outside-in testing approach here. I'm going to unit test connecting back to the API first, and then I'm going to end-to-end test. And this can be helpful because we're thinking more about, like, once we see how everything is connected together in our implementation, that can help us think about, in Cypress, how to mock it out to be able to kind of do the end-to-end testing. So I think that approach will work better for us here. That's what I did in the React Native testing stream as well. But it'll be very exciting to get into Cypress's features for how to handle this. All right, so I got my cheater monitor up here looking at the options and looking at how I did things before. Am I on the right branch? Yeah. So thinking about here, we're going to think at a unit testing level, how can we connect back to a server? First, before we do anything else, we need to think about how Redux is going to be able to do things asynchronously. There's a few different options, and I've been using Redux-Thunk so far. It is pretty straightforward, and so for kind of the simple tutorial apps that I've been working on, it works great. I'm sure it works for production applications as well. It's really great, but Redux-Thunk is a good fit. I'm very glad that I explored this in advance. Wait, is my audio on? Yeah, it is. Great. Hello, you can hear me. This is wonderful. So I'm really glad I explored this in advance because Redux-Thunk was not as easy to unit test as I expected. And this was really surprising to me. I thought, to indulge in a bit of my opinions for a bit, I thought that Redux was all about kind of exposing low-level things and interacting with them in just the same way. And yet when it came to testing with Redux-Thunk, things were very complicated and there was libraries that were indirect, and that was very confusing to me. So as a result, the unit tests we're going to write for Redux-Thunk are going to be pretty low level. We're going to be testing action creators directly, and then we're going to be unit testing everything all together. So that'll be interesting. Hopefully I'll do a Vue TDD tutorial sometime soon, and you can see with Vuex, Vue's built-in state management layer, there's a bit of an interesting kind of integration test option to test the state management as a whole. But we'll move forward with this for now. All right, so we're going to add in Redux-Thunk next. So let's add that in. We'll just keep all this in one branch for today. I think that'll be fine to do one big PR. So we're going to add Redux-Thunk. And while that's installing, I'm going to pull up the cheater monitor here. Just see what we're doing. I think I'm going to go ahead and add Axios. Axios is I'll pull it up on here in case you haven't run across it. Axios.js. It's very, 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 very popular. It's a HTTP client for browsers. It is a bit more of a simple API than the Fetch API. And I actually read in the Cypress docs that they don't currently support mocking out the Fetch API. So using Axios is going to help there as well. I like the way Axios works to be able to kind of configure an Axios instance and export it as a module to the rest of the app. And you'll see that in just a second here. Why have I not starred Axios? Axios is great. There, I've given it a star. This is great. Support the open source projects you do with a star and maybe even donation, maybe even contributing. I would recommend it. All right, so we're going to pull down Axios as well. Great. So now we're going to need to configure Thunk. And you'll see what Thunk, if you haven't used Thunk before, you'll see what it is in a moment as we get a chance to use it. But we just need to follow the guides and do what the guide says to add it into our store configuration here. We're going to need apply middleware and compose from Redux. And then we're just going to need Thunk, and then we're going to compose these middleware, I think. We're going to add apply middleware thunk, and then we add the DevTools enhancer so that we have access to both of those. Cool, so that should work there. All right. And then now we're going to create the API itself. Do I want that to live under the store? I'm going to put it in this app. I'm going to put it under the store so it's easy to access there. So what we can do, we can import Axios, and then we can const API and create an instance. And we can configure it. We're going to give it a base URL. And the URL we're going to use is actually a standalone API I've created. Sandbox API. Not that one. Sandboxapi.reststate.org. So it's a sample API for experimenting with the JSON API format. JSON API is a certain format for REST web services. I love it. There's a lot of automatic tooling that you can do to use it. We're going to be doing manual tooling here, setting up our Redux store layer, but it's really useful. And you can sign up and create an account on Sandbox API to get access to data, and it shows you what the data looks like. Give me all the posts, and it shows up there. I've added in restaurants and dish endpoints as well because I use this for these tutorials, so that's going to be useful. So we're going to have a base URL of sandboxapi.reststate.org. We're going to need headers, I believe. Oh, do we not have that in the docs? Headers. Well, we'll let it give us the error, and we'll add the headers in at that time. But we do need an authorization header, bearer, and we need an authorization token. And I guess this is going to show up on the screen, so that's great. You can log in to my account if you want. I'll probably invalidate this after the stream so you can not see it, but I'm definitely going to pull up Postman. When I log in here, I'm going to put that on the other monitor so you can't see my password. Probably it's going to pull up on the main monitor here. So I'm just going to hide it if it ever starts up. This is very slow. Well, let's fill the time and let's talk while it's loading up. Oh, no, now I want to hide it. BRB. All right, I'm back and my password is safe. So let's find this here. I don't want to log into localhost. I want to log into Sandbox API production. And I've gotten a token. So that's nice and easy. Sandbox API website has that information there. Here's my token that I'm going to invalidate at the end of the stream. So there you go. So there's our token. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to hard code the token into the app. In a real app, you'd want to put in a login screen, of course, and you could test that out. But this will keep things simpler to keep us focused on just kind of one thing at a time. So this will send the header that we need. And so this way, as we come out of here, we can just make requests against this API just to the endpoint that we need. And we don't need to be concerned with this configuration everywhere throughout the app. So that's going to be really useful. I wanted to set up the real API here so that as we go into unit tests, we can sort of see how I've gone about that and how we're mocking things out. Great. All right, so let's think about our tests. And let's look at our tests to see here. Unit store restaurant spec. Yeah, so let's do the actions. Okay. So there's a few different actions we're going to want to do. We're going to want to save the restaurant, but we're also going to want to load a new restaurant as well. So that'll give us a new opportunity to test drive that out. And now I'm kind of regretting the fact that I said dishes reducer here. So let's create a restaurant just to mirror the structure of our files in production. And we'll do actions. So using Thunk, our action creators are actually going to get more substantial. We're going to have some asynchronous stuff happening in there. And so it definitely makes sense to test those out at this point. So let's do here, describe restaurant actions. Really action creators is the more correct terminology. And so let's describe load restaurants. We're going to load the restaurants when the application starts. So what do we want it to do? I'm going to use the describe for that. And so I'm going to have another it in here for the test. It stores restaurants from the retrieved from the API. All right, so how are we going to test this out? How are we going to unit test this action here. And I really like the unit test here because it's helping me think about from the outside how I want this action creator to work before I get into the implementation of it. So it's going to be helpful, and it's going to be helpful to describe to y'all how we have this set up as well. Okay, so let's say here, so we're going to call it, so we're going to say load restaurants. And the way Thunk works is that action creator returns an action that that returns another function that Redux-Thunk is going to call it and pass dispatch to it. So we need some kind of dispatch function. And so then after all this, we're going to do then, because this needs to run asynchronously, so we need to check after it's done. And if we're running something asynchronously in the test, what we can do to make sure the test runner waits for it to finish is we can just return the promise from that out of the test itself. So then in the then block, after this happens, what do we want to do? So we want to confirm the dispatch to have been called with. So what do we want to dispatch? Well, we need a new action, store restaurants. Because instead of just one add restaurant to add one restaurant, we need store restaurants, something to say, put in a bunch, overwrite whatever's currently in the store, or if there's nothing there, overwrite it with the restaurants I'm providing here, because I've done a load from the server. So we're going to store restaurants, and we need some kind of restaurants data that we're going to confirm goes in there. So our linter is telling us that none of this exists, so let's kind of get to it. So first, we're going to import, let's just start at the start, load restaurants. Load restaurants from, and let's see how to get there. We're going to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. That's rough. It's not very readable. Source, store, restaurants, actions. So we'll see if we can clean that up a bit later. So we've got load restaurants there. Then what's dispatch? Well, dispatch can be a jest function, a mock function. Because the deal is we don't need dispatch to actually do anything. All that we're doing is confirming that it was called, confirming that an outgoing message was sent to our dispatch, confirming that this is what's outgoing from the load restaurants action creator. So that's all that's needed there. We do need a store restaurants action. So let's just import that from actions as well. Restaurants needs to be something. And it doesn't need to be too much in particular, but just for the sake of visualizing it, like let's write it out the way it would actually look. Restaurants. So we're now that we're going to be interfacing with the web service, we're going to be receiving data in the format that the web service sends back. So now we're going to get to see restaurant objects instead of just restaurant names. So the JSON API format, each record has a type. Restaurants, it's plural. I don't know if JSON API specifies that, but restaurants is potentially plural. That's the way my API is set up, at least. Selva Greg says this is front end only. Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, I'm focusing just on test driving the front end here in React itself. When we get to the end-to-end testing, we're going to talk about whether you want your Cypress end-to-end test to run through to the back end or not. But the backend I'm using is this existing sandbox API that I've built out. I built it out in Rails because I do a lot of Rails and I like Rails a lot. Certainly there's a lot of benefit if you haven't used Ruby before in using like an Express backend or a JavaScript backend. But I would plug a few blog posts and a few series I have on the backend if you want to be able to very quickly set up a REST API. So let's see here. On Coding It Wrong, Rails, the easiest way to create a web service. So I'm going to paste that in the chat. Here's a blog post about quickly creating a web service in Rails. So there you go. So this walks through how easy it is to create a web service using Rails. Rails was built before web services and rich front ends like React existed, but all the business logic and all the validation and all the removal of boilerplate they have make, in my opinion, Rails the easiest way to create a web service. And you can get into it very quickly using these blog posts and a screencast series that I linked to in there to get into that really quickly. Of course, GraphQL is a great option as well. I haven't played around with GraphQL quite as much, but there's trade-offs between REST APIs and GraphQL, so consider each one that you want. Our setup here, as long as you're using Redux, your front-end testing approach would be similar to what we're doing here. And these principles you could apply to something like connecting to Apollo client for GraphQL as well. So, Selva Greg, I hope that answers your question. Sweet. All right, so let's go into here. Again, thinking about kind of unit testing our action creator here to connect to the backend web service. So we have restaurants there. Let me get back to my cheater monitor. Oh, and I see that Silver replies. I'm focusing more on the JavaScript route, but I'll check it out. Thanks. Yeah, definitely. I would love if you, Selva, Greg, if you would like to chime in, certainly here if you multitask, or later on React-to-Flux or on Twitter. I'd love to hear what you're learning and what you're doing for JavaScript on the back end, because I want to get into it. Like, I want to have a JavaScript framework that I can personally pull from to build out JavaScript on the back end. It just seems like there's a lot of work to do it, and it's not just quite so out of the box as Rails is. So I'm definitely looking forward to learning, and a lot of my coworkers are getting into JavaScript on the back end as well. Cool. Thanks for chiming in. I appreciate it. All right, so moving forward with this test. So we have our data, and for the sake of visibility in the test here, I'm going to put it in the format that it comes in from the back end. There's an ID attribute that's the kind of the primary key. We can just call it 1 here. And then other attributes are nested under this attributes object. In our case, I think name is the name of the field. So sushi place. So that's one restaurant. And just for the sake of completeness, let's add a second one in here. So restaurants 2, and we can call this one burger place. So this is sort of an example of what the data coming back from the web service might be. And so we want to confirm that what comes back from here is those restaurants, that when we dispatch the store restaurants action, that these restaurants are what's passed in. There should not yet be any way for that to happen, but we're going to use test-driven development to get us there to show us. All right. Let's save this test and see what happens. I think that Jest has not caught it. I think I might need to restart Jest. We use Mocha on our project in production right now, our Vue.js project, so I'm not as familiar with. Oh, you see what happened? I did this when I was doing a test run of this as well. I didn't add the spec suffix onto there. That seems like something that would be nice for Jest and Mocha to add as a warning, like, hey, found a file in there. You might be doing something wrong because you don't have a spec suffix. I've seen that in a lot of different test frameworks, actually. All right, now we see that test happening, and it's failing, which is excellent. And it says load restaurants is not a function. So we are importing load restaurants from restaurant actions there, but it's not actually a function. So let's define it. So in this file, I want to export const load restaurants. And let's really test drive this at a low level. We want to have a load restaurants, and we'll make it a function. I am going to make it an arrow function here, but that's it. Like, we're not going to have it do anything. It's just a function. So let's get past this current error and see what the next error our tests tell us about. Now it says the result of calling that function is not a function. So we need to kind of return another function. And we're going to use the sort of chained arrow function format. I'll explain it a bit more once we get to the more substantial implementation. But if we have these chained arrow functions, this will be a function that returns a function. We rerun our test. Now it says cannot read property then of undefined. So we're not actually returning a promise out of here. We're returning nothing. So we need a promise because this is really going to be a real asynchronous thing. And I wouldn't often do this, step down to this low-level steps. But I am going to do it this time. So we're going to just return promise.resolve. And incidentally, if you haven't worked with promises directly, Axel Rauschmeier is one of my favorite people to read about new JavaScript features from. So let me just search here, Tuality promises. His blog is called Tuality. Actually, he is Tuality ES6. Let me find his book. Next. Exploring ES6 is his book. It's available for free online. So it's at exploringjs.com. Sorry, Axel, I'm blocking ads. I haven't unblocked them yet. I'll do that because I really like you and I paid for your book and I want to support you with ads as well. If you go to exploringjs.com, you can see links to his different JavaScript books, including Exploring ES6. I think many or most of them you can read online, but you can also buy the ebook version. So if you read the online version, search for promises. This will walk you through what promises are. So you may have used them from the outside and just learned that you chain .then and .catch onto them. But if you want to use them at a more low level, like I'm doing here, you can read about them here. My linter actually doesn't like that because I forgot to update that. You can say environment ES6 is true in the linter, and that should satisfy that. There we go. Returning promise.resolve. So now we're returning a promise from load restaurant, so let's see what the error is now. We expected the mock function to have been called with this data, but it was not called. And that makes sense. There's actually no way for this function to have access to that restaurant data. So how do we want it to get access to it? So let's think through that. This kind of starts to get into like, okay, how do we want to implement this method? Well, we want to import the API and use it. Import API from parent directory API. So we want to call the API there, and instead we want to return API.get restaurants. So there's a /restaurants URL we can get the data from. So that's going to get the data, but it's not going to actually call the dispatch. So let's think about how things are working here. And again, you probably, like the first time you use Axios, or even the first time you test it, this might not be the way that you would write it out. You'd probably want to just see, for Axios and for Redux-Thunk, how things work. Because again, we're unit testing just some functions here, but just because we're unit testing it out doesn't mean that that's the way that Redux-Thunk wants them to work. So we're going to find that out when we end-to-end test it and connect it all together. And I probably wouldn't be doing that. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to kind of do some pre-work here. Kind of a spike. A spike basically means I'm going to code something out without test driving it just to see how it works, to make sure my understanding is validated. And then even after spiking it, I might throw out the code or put it over onto the cheater monitor and go back through and test drive it out afterwards. So that's how I've had confidence, unless I've forgotten something, that this kind of two function calls is how we want things to work. So dispatch is going to be passed in to the second function call. So we'll receive dispatch in here. So after we get the restaurants, then we're going to call then response. And I'm going to do it this way, response object. I'll call it that. So this is the response object that Axios returns to us. And so in here we need to do a few different things. Response body equals response object dot data. So we need to drill into the data property to get the response body out of it. And so then, check it out, if we look at the documentation, if I can find it, for, maybe it's back here. Yeah, sandboxapi.reststate.org. So in the response body, there's another data property. So this is actually kind of unintuitive about using Axios with JSON APIs, that there's two datas. And so that can get confusing. I can often return too few or too many of them. Const restaurants equals response body.data. And if you just chain data.data, then it can be confusing and look like an error. But if you use nice named temporary variables, that can explain why this is happening. So then we want to dispatch. So now we're at the point where we're ready to dispatch this. We expected the mock function to be called dispatch. But check it out. In the output they put here, they show we expected the mock function to have been called with the restaurants and then with type undefined. So that doesn't actually look right. So let's go back and kind of fix that. This is because we've imported store restaurants action, and that's not actually defined, and we want it to exist. So let's do that. Export const store restaurants equals store restaurants. All right. So that now exists. So now when we rerun, we save our file and the test automatically reruns, we can see, yeah, okay, so it's looking for the function to be called with restaurants and then with a type of store restaurant. So that's great. So now we're at the point in our production code where we can do that. We can call dispatch, and the action we're going to pass it is type store restaurants, and then restaurants is the other property, and that's just going to be the data we just structure from there. So this is how we're going to want it to work for real, but we haven't mocked out the API yet. So let me just save it. I guess this would be an order to do it in. It runs. And it looks like it's actually hitting the server. So it's actually including a bunch more data. I'm actually glad it failed because we don't really want to be hitting the server in our unit test. Partially, like, look at all this stuff. I have tons of restaurants that I've added in there in my login, and our unit test can't connect against that. So for unit tests especially, probably also for end-to-end tests as well, but especially for unit tests, we want to mock out the API. So you can do that by using some kind of Axios-specific mocking library, but a lot of times if you're writing code, like it's good to know how to mock things out directly so that whatever dependencies your code has, you can isolate them and mock things out that way. So I had to learn about this in Jest because I've mostly been working in the Mocha testing library with Sign-On, which is the testable library that's generally used there. But again, luckily I worked ahead to realize and to kind of figure out how this works with Jest. So let's kind of see what I did here. So what we can do is we need to, in the test, import the API. And we're going to need to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Source, store, API. But then after we import the API, I'm going to call jest.mock, and we pass in the path again. And I don't remember off the top of my head. We can check the docs. Somehow this mocks out what that is. I forget if it prevents passing through at all, or if it just gives you the option to override different functions on the API with a mocked version. But regardless, it's going to get us what we need here. So in our test, we've said we want to mock out the API, and we're connecting it to it from our unit test here. And so before we actually dispatch, what we want to do is say, for API.get, the API.get function that we're using down here, we want to mock the resolved value. And so this is actually going to give us a value that is resolved from a promise. So what is the value that we want? Well, we want this to follow the structure that Axios really has. We have a data property on the response object. And then for the body of the request, we have a data property as well. That's those weird nested data. And then the data there is just the restaurants. So this, we're mocking out the API to say, hey, if the server, let's say the server returns this data, we confirm this. So let's run through the test and see. We kind of define this constant of this restaurant's data structure. We say we want to mock the dispatch function, and then we say, hey, API get is going to return this data. So then we say, when we call load restaurants and pass dispatch, what we should get back is a dispatch of, or not get back, but what should be dispatched is the store restaurants action with the restaurants that came from the server's data like this. So that's what we're testing. So let's rerun this test and see what happens. And it passes. And that's definitely because I'm using the cheater monitor, because it's a few different pieces to kind of wire up together. So this is what we want from the unit test. And let me take a quick detour here to talk about confidence. You could say, well, hey, anytime I'm mocking something, I have less confidence because it's not using the real system. And so I want to mock as little as possible. And yeah, I guess the server here, like the data could change, but it would be best if I could spin up a local server and really hit it to really run these tests. That could be good for end-to-end tests. We'll get there in a minute. But the idea of this lower level unit testing is saying, let me isolate this component and say, how does this component work independently of everything else? Defining the contract of the inputs and the outputs that it has. If we have the input of this load restaurant call and the input of this data returned from the API, then the output we should get is this dispatch that is called there. And we could talk more about testing philosophy at another time, but that's a good approach to have, certainly for unit tests. So we've got this passing, and that's really good. So let me think here. Let me think if I want to go ahead and do the add restaurants. I think I don't. I think I want to go ahead. We've had enough time down at the unit testing level here that let's get things wired up to our end-to-end test. No, I think I'm going to regret that. I think things are going to fail when we add in the restaurant because it's not going to hit the server properly and things like that. So let's go ahead and test that out as well. Maybe that's a way to practice what we've been doing here. So we have our load restaurants action. Let's commit that to version control though. So we add ES6, which I think we don't need anymore. So I'll just do that as a separate commit. Add ES6 to linter for promise use. All right. So let's look at the changes. We add Axios. We add Redux-Thunk. And so again, let me take a moment, not again, let me say it for the first time. What a Redux-Thunk is going to let us do, we haven't used it yet, but it's going to let us use this form where when we dispatch an action, when we call an action creator, dispatch is going to be called to it later so that we could run asynchronous stuff and things like that. So that's what Redux-Thunk is going to allow us to do. I'll go ahead and commit this. You know, we don't even need Thunk at this point. Yeah, you know what? This is making me regret this. I do want to kind of connect all this up to make sure it's working before we commit anything or even commit to this approach of having an asynchronous action work like this. This is just so different, and I'm new enough to Redux-Thunk that I want to see it connected together before we do anything else so I can be confident. So now let's step back up to our end-to-end test and say what we can do. How can we test? We can at least make sure that things don't blow up, but how can we test and confirm that this is really working and that we're really connecting to our server to be able to do this end-to-end testing. Well, one thing that the user could see is they could see some initial data loaded onto the screen. And so let's think about that. In our end-to-end, in our adding a restaurant spec, let's do this. Data from server, or say restaurants from server displayed at start. So that's something that we can test for. So let's do that. So we could say cy. So what kind of restaurant we want? Let's say initial restaurant name. We'll say cy.contains restaurant name. Yeah, and that'll just confirm that that restaurant name is there. So how are we going to call that here? So const initial restaurant name spaghetti place. Because I'm in the mood for spaghetti. I'm going to need a snack break after this. I'm going to check for spaghetti place at the start. And this is going to fail, I think, actually. Let's just see what happens here. The failure might not be a useful message at this point because we've changed enough stuff. But let's just see what happens. In Cypress, adding a restaurant spec. CY visit failed. Oh, that's because I haven't restarted parcels. Let me start that up. Again, Cypress, as I've mentioned on a previous stream, Cypress recommends that you start up your server separately from the Cypress process. And then on CI, you can just manually run a thing to put them together. The server is up, so let's rerun the tests. Okay, so the page does come up without failing. It's looking for spaghetti place and it's not found. So we hope, well, actually no, we haven't wired anything up yet. So let's wire things up in our production code, and then we'll look at how to kind of stub this out and mock this out. Actually, I think this will show our end-to-end test hitting the real server. So let's do that. Wire things up. What we're going to want to do here is in our restaurant list page, when we first load up the component, we want to load things from the server. So let's pull in load restaurants, add restaurant. And because I'm not on React every day, I can never remember if it's component did mount or component will mount that is deprecated. Let's find out which one it is. Component will mount is deprecated in React 16.3. Okay, so component did mount at least will work for us. And here we call this props load restaurants. So I'm going to call load restaurants here and see what happens. Reload. Oh, load restaurants is not a function. That's because we need to map it in there. This is Redux. We got to be explicit. Like, you can't just infer things that are there. We want that data flow to be totally clear. All right, interesting. So we made a request to the restaurants, and now we're checking if the spaghetti place was displayed, but it never was. So let's check the console. In Cypress, we have access to the real browser console, so that's really nice. Let's rerun here and give it a try. Restaurants 304. And we are getting data back. A bunch of data is coming back, but it's not getting displayed in there. So let's so in Cypress we don't have access to the Redux tool, so let's switch over to run this in the real browser. Make sure our network request goes. XHR. We got our data coming back. We don't have any console errors, so let's check out Redux. Store restaurants. The action has the restaurants coming in. Oh, so yeah, so this is something we've actually driven out here. We've driven out this action that dispatches store restaurants, but I think our reducer is not doing anything with that. So do we want to, I don't think we need to test, to write a unit test for the reducer at this point, because this one's going to be even more trivial than before. Again, our end-to-end test caught the problem to walk us through it. And we could, it wasn't 100% obvious. We had to look around a little bit. And so if you wanted to unit test it out, you could do that. So if we're storing restaurants, it's just going to be action.restaurants is going to be our new state. So I think this is going to make things work. So let's rerun. Hit localhost 1234. Objects are not valid as a React child in some restaurant items. And I've run into this enough times that I'm pretty sure I know what's going on. This is in some restaurant items in restaurant list. So what's happening here is we are taking in restaurant names at this point, because up until this point we've been storing just restaurant names. But now that we're connecting to the server, we're getting real data coming back, so we need to make things more robust to handle this new data structure. So let's kind of walk through this from the outside in. So in the restaurant list page, we're calling the restaurant list with the restaurants. Let's change this prop to be called restaurants. Now in here, this is going to be called restaurants. And we did some refactoring to split this functional component up into a few child components. And so we're going to need to pass this along. So restaurant items, I want it to be called restaurants as well. We're going to check the length of that. And then if we have some restaurant items, we're going to pass those along. And then we map through here, restaurant. So now the things get a bit different. So our restaurant, as we saw in that data structure in the unit test, a restaurant has an ID. So for our key, as we're iterating through things here in React, we can just use the restaurant ID, and that's going to be a much better key. It shouldn't collide at all if keys are unique. We're going to link to, let's do restaurant name for now. We're going to probably want to refactor that afterwards. Let me make a note about that. On the stream, refactor to have URL have restaurant ID. So maybe we'll get back to that a bit later. But for now, to minimize the changes we're making, we do restaurant attributes name and restaurant attributes name. This is something that can be very easy to forget about when you're using JSON API. But that's the structure that the attributes are grouped together under this object. And that's to make it more robust, to have relationships stored in a separate attribute and things like that. Links as well. So yeah, you want to go to restaurant attributes name here. So let's give this a try, see if this saves the blow up. It's already kind of automatically refreshed thanks to Parcel, but let's rerun the test from the start and see what happens. Okay, so we are in fact getting restaurants back from the server, but we're not getting Spaghetti Place. And this is because, luckily, that is the name of a restaurant that I haven't put on the real server in my real user account. So Spaghetti Place is not there. So now we've actually confirmed that we've hit the server, but we want to mock that out instead. And Cypress has some great tools for doing that. And actually, you can even get into the question. This came up in the Reactive-Flux testing channel just a few days ago. The question of how do you want to test the server? Do you want to really hit the server or not? So if you go into the Cypress docs, and on the sidebar, you go down to guides and network requests, they walk through this. Let me see here. So there's two strategies. You have the ability to choose whether to stub responses or allow them to actually hit your server. You can not stub responses, and here's the pros and cons. Or you can stub responses, and here's the pros and cons. So Cypress recommends to use tests that hit the real backend sparingly. Don't do that very much. And stubbing responses, use that for the vast majority of your tests. And so that's what we're going to actually do here. Maybe on a future stream or some point, I'm going to kind of work through and experiment through actually hitting a real server, maybe a locally running server. And as Selvar Greg mentioned, if you do have your backend running in JavaScript, that can make it much easier to spin up an instance of your backend, kind of just running in your local stack there to be able to hit it. Whereas if it's in different technology like Ruby or Golang or something like that, it's more likely to run very separately. Also, it depends on your team structure. So if you have a front-end team and a separate back-end team, you might not have easy access to their code and their setup or things like that. So in our usage, we're going to stub out these back-end tests. And for end-to-end tests, that gives you reliability. You may say you want the confidence of really hitting the back-end, but if that causes flake in your test, that causes your test to be flaky, to be unreliable, or just to sometimes change when the back-end changes it, you want to be confirming in these end-to-end tests here that your application, your front-end application works. And then to test that the front-end and back-end connect together, you can have just a few tests in Cypress that are automated, or you can just do it manually. And you need to feel that out for yourself. I was on an Apple TV app recently, I guess it was a couple years ago now, where I wanted automated testing, and so I had automated tests that really did hit, even just for one test, that hit the real backend. But it was flaky enough that I kept it out of my automated test suite. I ran it only manually when I just wanted to check and see that the backend was still up and still working the way that I thought it was. So all that to say, for our testing here, we're going to stub out those backend responses. And let's pull up on the cheater monitor here to see how I did that. Fixed restaurant E2E test. Okay, so this is really great and really simple in Cypress. This is actually my first time stubbing out backend requests in Cypress because I haven't gotten to use it on a production project. We're using different kind of E2E testing runner on my current client project that I did not get a choice over. And the pain points I've been hearing have gotten me even more excited about Cypress than I was in the past. So let's put this in. cy.server. So cy.server, and this is described in the docs, this basically says start up a fake server and run all of my API requests to it. Then we're going to call cy_route to configure a route in that server that says here's a route that I want to make available. We specify the method, which is get. We specify the URL, which is restaurants. That's the endpoint that we've configured. And then we want a response. So here, this response is just the response body. So we just need one data element in there. And so now let's put this in. We're going to need our JSON API response again of type restaurants. ID is just 1. And then attributes here, name is the spaghetti place. Actually, I can even move this initial restaurant name up here if I want and put that in here. So it kind of helps us to see the response I want from the server is that the initial restaurant name is there. And you could extract this out to a separate function, or even Cypress has some fixtures to set up some data that you can work with easily. But at least for now, I want to put it just inline in here. That's good enough for now. So let's save this and let's rerun the Cypress test to see if it works, see if I did it right. Nope, let's see here. What's the error here? Syntax error. Type error. Initial restaurant. Doesn't look like a type error. This doesn't look like exactly what I was seeing in there. So let's just kind of stop and restart Cypress here. Or restart the test. Duplicate declaration initial restaurant name. That's the problem. Okay, cool. I should really catch that with a linter. So let's make a note about that. Duplicate declaration with linter. Kind of fun with the whole the extra time we have today. We can get into some of these edge cases and clean things up a bit. Let's catch that duplicate declaration with the linter. But for now, let's just fix it. Rerun. Duplicate declaration, that doesn't seem right. So let's just stop it and restart it again. Start that individual integration test suite. Restaurant name, restaurant. Did I not save it? I didn't remove it. I didn't do even a little bit to fix the problem, but now I have. So now check it out. You can see our test is moving on. Something else has failed, so we'll get back to that in a little bit. But we can see by going back in history with Cypress here that we can see the spaghetti places right there. So that is provided initially, and none of the other records from the server were provided initially. So this is great, and this is confirming that our initial loading of the data is working. Now we have a failing test, and I suppose if you wanted to stick very, very closely to the way red-green refactor works, you might want to make sure that that's green. But I feel good enough about how things are moving now. So let's commit what we have, and then I'm going to take a break because I'm starving. I need some granola bars or something. I'll take a break to grab that really quick, and then we'll move on to test driving out our add method in there. So let's review our changes. We have our end-to-end test here to confirm that restaurants are built at the start. And so this is interesting. So notice this, that even though we first unit tested and then we step back up to the end-to-end testing level, you can commit them all at the same time. And so, the order you build stuff out in isn't necessarily the order that you commit things, because you can stage one bit at a time and commit it in. And so thinking about how you commit code and work in small chunks is part of test-driven development as well. And I recommend thinking about it. So cool. Okay, we have our restaurants from the server displayed at start. That was just a single line. But as a note, I like to have this level of abstraction. Like we have our top level test. This is kind of lower level. Maybe I set that up elsewhere. But other than that, yeah, heck, you know what? Like, let's stick to it. I was about to talk about this level of abstraction thing with testing. So let's go ahead and do it. It was really nice when our test at the top level here had a very readable set of functions that we could go through, but that's not the case anymore. So let's do it. Let's pull that out. So let's say set up initial restaurant. We'll pass in the initial restaurant name. I'm going to cut this out. And make a function, set up initial restaurant name. Oh, this other restaurant we need back here. So now we've moved the Cypress setup into a function. So now our top level test reads a lot better. We set a few variables. We say we're going to set up the initial restaurant. Then we're going to visit the URL and then confirm that that restaurant is displayed at the start, etc., etc. So now our top level test operates at one level of abstraction. So that's a lot nicer. Let's make sure it actually works. And in fact, let's rerun our whole suite. Well, you know, adding a dish is probably going to fail. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, it fails. Right. Okay. So, but what was working before still works. Our spaghetti place restaurant shows up in there. Cool. So I'm glad that I felt convicted about that, and I felt like I needed to be consistent. So let's reset again, and let's add these changes. So we're updating our test here to add some high-level new functions. We're adding this function to set up the initial restaurant and the function that restaurants from the server are displayed at the start. So now getting back to what I was about to say, even though restaurants from server displayed at start is just a single line, it's more characters to type this out than just to type out the implementation here. But it keeps our test here at a single level of abstraction. So this means we have these high-level functions that step down into implementation details down below. And this is valuable in any code you have, no matter how small it is, but especially when you have a test file that's going to get longer and longer potentially. Operating at a higher level of abstraction so you can kind of skim through and see what's happening is really important. All right, so we add Axios, we add Redux-Thunk. Okay, all right, well, there's a lot happening here in this changed restaurant list, so let's step through it. Okay, so this is restaurant list where we started taking in the restaurants instead of the restaurant names. So we pass those along, and then down here where we display the restaurant items, this is where we change to use the ID and the name attribute. So that'll make sense to include. Now, in our restaurant list page, we are pulling in the load restaurants action creator, and we're calling that action creator to load the restaurants. And just as a note, this confirms that things are working correctly with Redux-Thunk to kind of call things out. So down at our unit test level, we're just calling these functions directly. Our unit test doesn't know anything about Redux or about Redux-Thunk, but we've set up our function in a format that Redux-Thunk knows how to use and is going to work with it. Okay, so down here on the restaurant list page, we're using that new parameters of passing the restaurants parameter instead. We're wiring up load restaurants because Redux. Now in our store here, we're wiring up Thunk. Now that I think about it, I like smaller commits, so I think setting up Thunk as a separate commit would be nice. So let's just kind of focus on that. So before we do anything in our test here, let's not include that, but let's add Axios and Thunk. Not change that component, not change that component, not change that reducer. Have I skipped something? I think I have. Okay, but we'll change our yarn lock file to add that stuff in. And then we'll add in our main store. This is where we add in apply middleware and compose, we add Thunk, and then we add it in there. So now let's look at this. This commit just includes adding Axios and Thunk. We wire up Thunk there. And we update the log file. And we'll add the API store here. It's okay that API key is going in. Don't do this at home, kids. Leave those API keys out of your code. Yeah, that's fine for now. I'm going to invalidate that API key after the stream here. Feel free to log in and put embarrassing things. If you're one of the people on the stream right now, log in with my API key and put embarrassing things in there for us to see and feel very offended by. That'll be great. All right, so how can I summarize this? Get status. Okay, yeah. So we're adding in the new packages, the changes in the store to add in Thunk, and we're adding in the API configuration. Add Thunk and Axios. So that's one commit. Now we've got our changes that are happening in the application code to actually load the restaurants from the server. So we've got our changes, as I mentioned, to the end-to-end test to confirm that that restaurant from server is displayed at the start. We've got the changes to the restaurant list file where we're passing along restaurant objects instead of restaurant names. We've got our changes to the restaurant list page to wire up the load restaurants. We've got our new asynchronous action creator, load restaurants, that's going to dispatch the call to the API. and then is going to make the call to the API, and then with the data we get back, we're going to dispatch to Redux to make the change to store these restaurants. As a note here, note that in our unit test, we did not need any kind of Axios specific mocking library. We were able just to kind of mock the API directly. And in our end-to-end tests, we didn't need to as well, because Cypress handles mocking out web service requests. So when you operate in this way, you don't need a lot of library-specific changes. And because of that, if we switch from Axios to something customer different, these things would still work just fine. So I prefer to do that rather than reaching for an Axios-specific mocking library. But if it helps you, feel free to give it a try. But keep learning, keep trying new things. We have our changes to our reducers to store the restaurant, and that was nice and simple, so we didn't feel like we needed a unit test for that. And then we have our unit test here. Add test unit. Load restaurants. All right, so now we've got our Redux state layer set up. We've got our end-to-end testing and our unit testing working to load this data from the server. So next we want to add restaurants to the server, and we also want to load and add dishes from the server. So we're going to handle that next. I'm going to take a break for just a moment. I am starving, so I really need some granola bars. I'll be back in just a moment, and we're going to move on ahead with test driving out some more stuff. It'll be great. So see you in a second.